The wind tonight carries something ancient, something older than language, older than stone. As I stand upon the worn edge of the Ponte Santa Trinita, I feel the cobblestones still warm beneath my sandals, though the sun has dipped beneath the horizon. The Arno flows beneath me like a vein of molten bronze, murmuring its way through Florence, cradling reflections of ochre buildings, terracotta roofs, and the faint glimmer of candlelight flickering from open windows. I close my eyes for a moment, letting the breeze brush against my face. It smells of olive oil and dust, of baked bread and drying linen, and perhaps, if I concentrate, of oil paint just beginning to cure. Across the river, a woman is singing softly as she beats a rug over a balcony rail. Her voice blends with the bell from San Fridiano, a note that fades almost before I realize it's rung. This is Florence at dusk. The city exhales slowly, like a tired artisan lowering his chisel for the night. I take slow steps along the bridge. My fingers trail against the balustrade, cool and curved. These stones have been here long before my birth, and will remain long after my voice has faded. I like that. I like being small against time. I am no master, no genius, not like those whose names fill the mouths of tourists and patrons. But I am here. I watched them. I walked among them. I listened. I knew the men you dream about in books and paintings. Not all of them, not closely. But I breathed their air. When I was 16, I delivered sketch paper to the Bottega del Verrocchio. It was the first time I saw Leonardo, not as the polymath the world would one day hail, but as a restless apprentice with chalk on his lips and an untamed light in his eyes. He was crouched near a wooden frame, muttering to himself about shadows. He did not look up when I entered, but he said, "Don't crinkle the paper, it listens." I remember those words more clearly than I recall my father's face. Florence in those days was not quiet. It was bursting, cracking at the seams, with thought and vision. Every fresco on every chapel wall was an act of rebellion against mediocrity. Every sculpture was a gamble with eternity. But tonight it sleeps. I pass the narrow Via Maggio, where once I heard Sandro Botticelli arguing with a monk about the nudity of Venus. Even the gods must be painted naked, Sandro said, for the soul cannot wear robes. The monk muttered something about modesty, but I only remember the wine stain on his sleeve and the way Sandro's laugh echoed against the alley walls. A warm gust catches my cloak and carries with it the scent of lavender and beeswax. Somewhere a door creaks open. A dog barks once and is shushed. I am drawn forward by memory, or perhaps by the rhythm of my own footsteps, echoing against the quiet marble beneath my soles. It's strange to think that I have lived through the golden age of something the world now calls the Renaissance. At the time, it didn't feel golden. It felt tense, competitive, alive. There were whispers in every courtyard about which chapel commission had been won, which sculpture had been rejected, which sketchbook had gone missing, whose angel looked too human, or whose Christ not human enough. But here, on this bridge, none of that matters anymore. What remains is the hush, the dignity, the sigh of a city that once held the world in its palm. I pause by a small lantern post. The flame inside dances against a glass pane, cracked slightly at the corner. I once saw a boy draw that same lantern, only he exaggerated the crack until it became a lightning bolt. That boy's name was Michelangelo. He was furious, even as a child. furious with the sky, the marble, and especially himself. I often wonder if brilliance is born from dissatisfaction, if beauty is the fruit of unrest. Leonardo never stopped sketching because he never stopped wanting. Sandro's hands trembled unless they were painting. Even lesser-known artists like Ghirlandaio or Lippi carried a restless rhythm in their brushstrokes, like a heartbeat just below the surface. There is a kind of irony in it, that such peace should come from so much torment. I lean over the edge of the bridge and let my breath fog the stone. The river doesn't judge. It carries every reflection with equal silence. Kings and beggars, saints and sinners, all ripple the same across its surface. Above me, the stars begin to emerge, tentative, as if unsure if they are welcome in a sky that once lit the hands of genius. I think of the domes and towers, the hands that carved and painted them. Did they know? Did they feel history humming beneath their skin? Perhaps they did, or perhaps they only felt hunger, or doubt, or a longing they could never quite name. Perhaps genius isn't the presence of divine clarity, but the absence of peace. I pass an old beggar near the steps of the Santo Spirito. He mutters in sleep, clutching a rosary that's missing 2 beads. I wonder if he once held a brush, if his hands remember the texture of canvas. So many artists fall into silence. Not all brilliance finds its patron. The city is darker now. Only the highest windows still glow with firelight. Somewhere, a lute plays a lullaby I once knew. I cannot recall the words, only the ache. As I descend toward the street below, I brush my hand against the wall of an old workshop. Verrocchio's, I think. The paint stains are long gone, but in the grooves of the wood, I imagine I can still feel them. I wonder how many ghosts press their palms here, as I do now. Florence never forgets. Its silence is not emptiness. It is memory distilled. I reach the end of the bridge and pause once more to look back. The Arno still shimmers. A breeze stirs the surface, smearing the light into wavering ribbons. It looks almost like brushstrokes or tears. Maybe that's the trick of the Renaissance, to catch the light just before it breaks, to make permanence out of impermanence, to dream in pigment what the soul cannot keep. I exhale. The wind carries it down river. Somewhere in the distance, another bell tolls. Certainly, let's proceed with Section 2, continuing in English with the same immersive tone, historical layering, and gentle sensory rhythm. There is a silence that lives inside unfinished work, a quiet more profound than absence. It hums through the halls of chapels where scaffolding has been taken down too early, or perhaps never fully erected. Florence, for all its masterpieces, holds many such silences. I have walked among them, and once, I remember it clearly, I listened to a fresco speak. It was in the church of Ognissanti, early morning, long before Mass. The stone still clung to the night's coolness. I crept inside, as I often did, not for worship, but for the scent of pigment and the comfort of paint still drying. The artist, Domenico they called him, had left his tools behind. Brushes leaning in water jars, ochres thick on a marble slab, a damp sponge resting like a sleeping creature. And there, across the apse wall, was a figure only half-formed. A saint, I think, but her eyes had not yet been given definition. Her hand, outstretched in gesture, ended at the wrist. It was as if she were reaching into our world, seeking completion. That morning I watched the light move across her. The sun filtered through stained glass and landed on her unfinished face. The pigments awakened slightly, the reds warming, the pale blues softening into something almost alive. And in that moment I heard it, a whisper, perhaps only in my mind, or perhaps something more. She said, "They never gave me a name." Unfinished things linger longer than we expect. Their incompleteness becomes an invitation. I have found this true not only of art, but of people, of friendships, of love. Domenico Ghirlandaio was a kind man. Perhaps not the visionary that Leonardo was, but he understood light, and more importantly, he understood patience. He once told me that fresco was like planting seeds. You had to work quickly, but gently. Wet plaster does not wait, neither does time. He was teaching a young boy then, a boy with eyes too intense for his age, who resented being told to paint borders and feet when he longed to sculpt thunder. Michelangelo. Even then, he preferred the chisel to the brush. Yet Ghirlandaio insisted he learn the rules before breaking them. The smell of that chapel still visits me. Lime and smoke, chalk and sweat, a holy chemistry. The frescoes were not just images, they were living timelines. The plaster captured the breath of every moment it was touched. A single mistake sealed forever, unless chipped away. And even then, the wall remembers. There is something deeply human about that, the way we harden quickly and carry traces of what was first etched into us, sometimes beauty, sometimes regret. I remember a night when Ghirlandaio stayed long after the candles had burned low. He stood before a scene he had painted weeks before, running his fingers lightly across the robe of a kneeling figure. I asked him if something was wrong. He said, "I placed my mother's face in this figure, but now I think I have forgotten what she truly looked like." And then he smiled, with a sadness I did not yet understand, and said, "Perhaps all of Florence is a memory we're painting from, half remembered, half imagined." He was not wrong. Each wall tells a story, but only some are finished. The rest, they wait. The convent of San Marco has rooms full of such whispers. Fra Angelico's brush brought divine stillness to the cells, but not all his angels reached completion. One lingers in the corridor, wings merely outlined, gaze left blank. I stood before it once, wondering what emotion had been intended. Peace? Sorrow? Awe? Or was it never meant to be finished? Some artists fear death more than others. Fra Filippo Lippi used to say that to die before finishing a commission was to offend both God and the Medici. He painted like a man racing time. His strokes were swift, almost defiant. I once saw him kiss a nun's hand with the same tenderness he gave to the Virgin Mary in his works. Scandal followed him like perfume, but so did beauty. There's something oddly eternal in a half-painted wall. We expect art to conclude, to present itself whole. But perhaps that's not the purpose. Perhaps the truest art is the one that lets you step inside, pick up the brush in your mind, and finish the thought yourself. Florence, in its wisdom, left room for that. Every alley is a half-written sentence. Every shadow between columns, a comma waiting for meaning. Sometimes, as I wander past frescoes, still clinging to damp stone, I imagine the hands that once reached for those walls. Hands blistered from lime,
fingernails stained indigo, a drop of sweat falling, unnoticed, becoming part of the plaster, a laugh, a sigh, a prayer, baked into the surface for all time. Once I dared to touch the hem of a figure in a chapel, not out of disrespect, but longing. The wall was cool, gritty, breathing. I imagined the artist looking over my shoulder, smiling, or frowning, or simply fading into the silence. Not all frescoes are left unfinished because of death or war or forgetfulness. Some were abandoned by choice, not for lack of skill, but for lack of truth. When an artist cannot believe in a scene, he cannot complete it. That is a quiet tragedy. The wall prepared, the sketches drawn, the palette mixed, and then nothing. A chapel in the Alterano bears such a ghost. There you can see the outlines of a banquet scene, never painted. Just faint red marks, as if time bled through the plaster and tried to tell the story on its own. I once traced those outlines with my eyes closed.
I saw laughter, jealousy, a goblet raised too high, a hand reaching beneath the table, all of it invisible, but vividly present. They say ghosts haunt people, but I think they prefer walls. There's a melancholy joy in it all. Florence has no need to finish every story. It lets us dream through the ones it never completed, and in doing so, it keeps us awake, even as it lulls us towards sleep. The moonlight now falls through open arches. I walk beneath frescoed ceilings where time peels away paint in soft flakes. It is not decay, it is evolution. Even beauty must weather, even saints must fade. And yet, even as the color lifts, the form remains, the gesture, the intent. Tonight, I pass a cloister where pigeons coo from niches once filled with painted prophets. The air is still thick with lime and lavender, and I feel, deep within my chest, that something sacred remains. Not the image itself, but the yearning behind it. We are all frescoes in progress, layered, fragile, filled with places where the paint never quite dried, and that, perhaps, is the most human thing of all. Of course, let's continue now with Section 3, maintaining the immersive first-person tone, rich sensory detail, emotional undercurrents, and historical grounding. There is a stillness that lives within marble, not the stillness of lifelessness, but of potential, like a held breath, a thought not yet spoken. Every block of Carrara that reached Florence in those days carried inside it the possibility of divinity, or defiance, or longing. And it was in the hands of a few, just a few, that this silence became voice. I remember the first time I watched someone listen to marble. Yes, listen. It was Donatello, the master himself, standing barefoot on the stone floor of his studio, pressing his palm flat against a new slab of white. He did not speak. He did not measure. He stood there, unmoving, for nearly 10 minutes, eyes half closed. When I finally dared ask what he was doing, he said, without looking up, "Waiting for it to tell me who it is." I did not understand then, but I do now. Stone has memory. It holds the weight of the earth, the press of mountains, the erosion of rain, and the shadow of centuries. When carved, it does not yield, it transforms. The artist must not force the marble, but coax it. There is no violence in true sculpture, only conversation. I was never meant to be a sculptor, but I loved the sound of chisel on stone. It's a rhythm like heartbeat and thunder, sharp, clean, honest.
You cannot lie to marble. It exposes every hesitation. And I had many. Michelangelo, he had none. Even as a young man, he approached marble not with reverence, but with urgency. I remember seeing him at the yard where slabs were stored, his cloak dusted with white, a splinter in his palm, blood smeared carelessly across his wrist. He was smiling, not because of pain, but because he had just found a piece of stone he claimed was holding an angel. I thought he was mad. But weeks later, when I saw that angel take form beneath his hands, wings arched and face serene, I wondered if perhaps we are all mad who dream of freeing something from what others call lifeless. There is irony in the process. To create life, you must break. To reveal beauty, you must destroy what once was whole. Shards and dust gather at your feet as if mourning, but from the ruin a figure rises, not born, but revealed. In the Medici Gardens, I once paused before a newly unveiled sculpture, David. He stood taller than any man I knew, shoulders squared not with pride, but with purpose. His eyes, they did not look at Goliath. They looked beyond, as if seeing not a single foe, but the burden of being chosen. I asked Michelangelo once why he made David before the battle and not after. He said, "Victory is the moment everyone sees, but it is the decision, the weight of the stone still in hand, that makes the man."
Florence understood that. It admired strength, yes, but more than that, it honored resolve. And in marble, resolve is eternal. There were others, too, quiet masters whose hands shaped wonders. Desiderio da Settignano, whose Madonnas seemed to breathe. Rossellino, whose tombs made death look like sleep. Their work remains, though their names have faded, but I remember them. One summer afternoon, I stood beneath the loggia near the Palazzo Vecchio, watching the shadows creep along the statue's feet. There, Perseus held Medusa's head, and Hercules stood triumphant. Tourists, though we didn't yet call them that, gathered to gape. But I watched the marble itself. I imagined the weight of it in the beginning, the roughness, the labor, the months of chipping and shaping, and I wondered if any sculptor had ever wept when the work was done, because the silence between them and the stone had ended. For me, silence was the beginning. When I entered a studio, it was never the finished piece that drew me, but the half-formed figures emerging from blocks. A knee just visible, a shoulder hinted, the hint of breath in a neck still solid. That moment when nothing is fully human yet, but everything might be. Leonardo once wrote that sculpture was inferior to painting. He called it brutish, too physical, too reliant on brawn over intellect. But he never saw Michelangelo at work. He never saw the way he held a chisel like a quill, the way his eyes followed contours not yet real, but inevitable. Once I sat beside a statue in progress, an unfinished Pietà. Only the Virgin's arm had been shaped. Her hand rested upon invisible weight, her face absent, her sorrow still imagined. And yet I wept, because even in its incompleteness the marble spoke. Florence in those days echoed with such voices, not loud but deep. Walk into a church, and beneath the incense and prayers you could hear the echo of hammer on stone. Even now I sometimes hear it in dreams.
In the Bargello there is a bust carved by Donatello that never gained the fame of his bronze David. It sits quietly in a side room, gazing into nothing. I stood before it once and whispered, "Do you remember?" And I swear it answered, not in words, but in warmth. I felt it, faint but certain. The genius that once passed through those hands had left a trace. Stone is cold, yes, but in the right light, with the right memory, it holds heat. Even now, as I walk past the workshops near Via dei Calzaioli, I imagine the dust swirling in late sunbeams, the tap-tap-tap of shaping, the scent of crushed stone and candle wax, the apprentice sweeping, the master dreaming. There is no sculpture without silence, no form without stillness, and in Florence both remain. Certainly, let us move now into section 4, deepening the immersion and expanding the atmosphere of Renaissance Florence while continuing with historical depth, rich sensory elements, and reflective tone. When you speak beneath a dome, your voice does not simply echo. It lingers. It rises, curls around the columns, and settles into the air like incense. Inside Santa Maria del Fiore, the great cathedral at the heart of Florence, I once whispered a secret into the silence, and it felt as though the stone itself was listening. The Duomo is not just architecture, it is breath, a giant ribcage of faith and ambition, built not only to reach heaven, but to pull it downward, into the city, into us. Brunelleschi's dome, the miracle of its time, looms above like a thought made solid. To this day, I do not know how he conceived it. They say he studied the Pantheon, that he built models in secret, that he defied engineers, priests, and time itself. But I think he simply refused to listen to what was said to be impossible. The people called him eccentric, stubborn, sometimes cruel. But when I once saw him trace the curve of the inner dome with a long shadow cast by morning light, his hand trembling slightly, I understood. It wasn't arrogance, it was reverence. He didn't want to conquer the heavens, he wanted to join them. I spent many afternoons sitting quietly beneath that vast vault, watching the colors change with the sun. The frescoes, those swirling scenes of the Last Judgment, painted later by Vasari and Zuccari, seemed almost to breathe. Angels hovering, demons writhing, saints gesturing as though mid-conversation, and perhaps they were. I liked to imagine that the artists who worked on the dome still spoke to one another, long after their time, that every brushstroke carried a whisper from one soul to the next. Florence was always murmuring, not shouting, not preaching, but conversing, over dinner tables, over canvases, over marble blocks. The best ideas were born not in isolation, but in dialogue. And some of the most profound conversations happened not between men, but between man and space. In the sacristy, I once saw Alberti run his fingers along a column and say, "Proportion is not a law, it is a kindness." I didn't understand at first, but as I traced that same column's curve years later, I realized he meant that beauty lies not in strict symmetry, but in harmony, the quiet agreement between line and light, weight and breath. The churches of Florence were built on that principle, not merely as places of worship, but as instruments of wonder. The architecture sang. Sometimes, on rare evenings when the doors were left open and the city hushed, I would wander through the nave barefoot, letting the cold of the marble floor ground me. My footsteps would echo in long, slow patterns. I would murmur a name, Leonardo perhaps, or Fra Angelico, and wait to hear it return, softened, blessed by silence. It was in those moments that I felt closest to what the artists must have felt, not glory, not legacy, but intimacy, a knowing.
That the work, once begun, belonged no longer to the maker, but to the space, to the stone, to the people who would one day stand here and wonder who had whispered first. There is an irony in how we now speak of genius. We imagine the artists of the Renaissance as solitary flames burning against the dark. But I remember it differently. They talked constantly. Bromelleschi debated with Ghiberti about bronze doors. Leonardo wrote letters to Del Verrocchio critiquing brushwork and commending design. Botticelli drank with poets and scribbled notes between sonnets. Even Michelangelo, brooding as he was, once engaged in a heated discussion with Raphael in the shadowed halls of the Medici library. I remember only fragments of what was said, something about movement, about divinity, about the spine of a reclining figure, but the passion in their voices was thunderous. In the baptistry, the bronze panels of Ghiberti's Gates of Paradise stand still. But if you listen closely, you can hear them argue and praise and confess. Each scene a conversation. Abraham and Isaac, Jacob and Esau, Solomon and Sheba. Dialogue etched in metal, frozen in gold. Florence was never quiet, not truly. Even when the plague closed doors and silenced bells, I would hear the scratch of quills, the click of tools, the muffled muttering of a line recited, changed, discarded, reclaimed. Creation never sleeps, it only slows. Inside San Lorenzo, where the Medici tombs slumber beneath Michelangelo's careful hands, I once heard a monk describe the architecture as geometry touched by grace. He said the chapel was so perfectly balanced it could turn even the restless into pilgrims. I was not a religious man, but I believed him. There, among the white stone and measured light, the soul finds rest in form, not because it is perfect, but because it is considered. Every arch, every shadow, a deliberate offering, like the pauses in a sentence that make the words matter more. In one of the smaller side chapels, I discovered a crack in the fresco of a dove, a flaw, perhaps caused by dampness or time. But when the sun hit it just right, the crack formed a second wing, suggesting flight where once there was stillness. And I thought to myself, perhaps God likes imperfections too. That thought stayed with me. So many of Florence's greatest creations were born not from order, but from tension, from questions, from the need to answer the dome's echo with one's own voice. And so they did. They painted ceilings to reach the unreachable. They carved faces that mourned for those not yet lost. They built libraries that held more than books. They held breath. Today, tourists crane their necks to see the dome. They point, they photograph, they marvel. But they do not often listen. If they did, they might hear Brunelleschi arguing softly with Alberti about proportion. They might catch the low laughter of apprentices balancing ladders, or the sigh of a tired artist pausing to admire the curve of a cornice.
Or perhaps, if they are very still, they might hear someone like me, an echo from another time, walking slowly across the marble, whispering a name into the space where genius once sat. And if the dome is kind, it will whisper back. Certainly. Let's continue now with Section 5, drawing you deeper into the social world of Renaissance Florence, this time through warm, personal moments in the studio of one of its most influential masters. The finest meals I ever had were not served at the tables of noblemen or the candlelit halls of merchants. They were taken cross-legged on wooden planks in the back room of Andrea del Verrocchio's workshop, eaten from chipped bowls with paint-stained hands. To eat among artists is to be fed by more than food. The studio smelled always of sawdust and oil, of hot iron and ground pigments, and of onions, always onions.
Someone was forever sautéing them in the small hearth behind the larger workspace, seasoning them with herbs kept in a jar painted with cherubs. It was meant to be for holy water, I think, but it suited rosemary just as well. Verrocchio welcomed many to his table, not because he was soft, but because he understood that to sculpt beauty one must also break bread. It was there I first met Lorenzo de Credi, pensive and pale, forever sketching on the back of receipts. And Perugino, who would one day teach Raphael, though at the time he was mostly quiet, chewing slowly, his eyes always scanning the room, as if trying to memorize light itself. And then there was Leonardo. Even then, even at 17, he spoke little but watched much. During those dinners, he'd sit with a piece of stale bread in one hand and a dried fig in the other, drawing spirals in spilled wine on the table. One night, someone asked him what he was sketching. He said, "The motion of laughter." Everyone thought he was joking. He wasn't. The workshop bustled day and night. Apprentices swept floors, mixed gesso, heated wax for lost wax bronze casting. You could hear the clink of chisels, the scratch of charcoal, the impatient rattle of canvas being stretched too quickly. But come dusk, all tools were set aside, and from behind the partition, Verrocchio would appear with a loaf of bread beneath his arm and a bottle of wine already uncorked. He was not a large man, but his presence filled every corner of the room. His voice carried like a cello, low, resonant, never hurried. He could speak of Roman architecture and then switch mid-sentence to the comedy of a street juggler he'd seen outside Santa Trinita. He laughed deeply, though rarely. When he did, it was always with his whole chest, as if surprised by joy. I remember one evening when the stew had burned slightly. Someone, perhaps Lorenzo, complained. Verrocchio looked up and said, "Then let it teach your mouth to appreciate perfection when it finds it." No one complained after that. Meals in the workshop were not just nourishment, they were ritual. Bread was broken with fingers stained from lapis lazuli. Meat was passed beside a bust of Venus in progress. Wine was sipped beneath a crucifix still drying in the rafters. There was no boundary between the sacred and the daily. Art was both. Conversations drifted as freely as the smoke from the hearth. Sometimes someone would read aloud from a Latin manuscript. Sometimes a poem would be recited half seriously, with sauce still on the speaker's chin. I once saw Leonardo correct a line of verse not for its meter, but because it failed to describe the direction of the wind. That was his way, seeing structure in everything, even poetry.
And yet, despite his intellect, he was the one most amused by simple tricks. One night, a visiting blacksmith showed us how he could make sparks dance from a steel ring with nothing but spit and friction. Leonardo clapped like a child, then immediately tried to sketch the motion of the sparks before they faded from his mind. There was always someone carving in the corner, even during dinner. Always someone who couldn't quite stop working. One evening, I saw a young apprentice sculpting the fold of a robe in a lump of stale bread, so immersed that he forgot to eat. And Verrocchio saw it. He smiled and said nothing. In those days, apprentices lived more in the studio than in their own homes. They rose before dawn and sometimes slept beneath tables. Their dreams smelled of turpentine and wood smoke. But it didn't feel like hardship. It felt like belonging. I remember once waking in the middle of the night to the sound of laughter. Not loud, but warm. A group of students had stayed late after dinner to experiment with mixing shadow tones. They lit a small lantern beneath a thin linen sheet and painted shadows of their own hands in different hues. Someone made a puppet of a cat. Another sculpted a nose from leftover wax and placed it atop the lantern, casting monstrous silhouettes on the wall. They laughed not because it was funny, but because they felt free. It was moments like those that taught me more than any formal lesson. Verrocchio believed that a workshop was not a place of instruction, but a community of listening. The eye teaches the hand, he said, but the soul teaches both. He saw failure not as shame, but as the breath before revelation. He would often walk past a terrible sketch and say, "Good, now do worse, and then better." He never signed his works. Even when he created marvels, his bronze Christ, his delicate Madonnas, he left his name only in whispers. He said that the art should never remember the artist more than it remembered its own reason for being. In that workshop, time bent. The outside world, the noise of markets, the gossip of guilds, the politics of the Medici mattered little. What mattered was the rhythm of hammer to stone, brush to board, word to silence. And in the evenings, as wine darkened the bottom of the cups and candles sputtered in their holders, we would sometimes sit in silence, full and warm. Someone might hum a tune, someone else might speak a memory. And Verrocchio, who always lingered the longest, would stare into the fire and say something like, This is the breath between notes. Don't forget it. Art lives here too." I never did forget. Even now, when I pass a quiet studio, when I smell linseed and hear laughter drifting between wood beams, I remember those nights. I remember the taste of bread shared with minds brighter than I knew. I remember the way the light fell across Leonardo's face as he watched flames dance on the wall. I remember dinners in the workshop, not as meals, but as masterpieces. Certainly. Let's continue now with Section 6, focusing intimately on Leonardo da Vinci during his formative years, his mind, his solitude, and his luminous curiosity, within the contemplative and immersive frame of this Renaissance sleep journey. There are certain minds that do not rest, not at dawn, not in sleep, not even in prayer. Leonardo da Vinci was one of those. He didn't pace like the anxious or rant like the possessed. He simply lived 3 lives at once. While his body sat quietly, legs folded, candle burning low, his mind would leap between anatomy and flight, between river currents and celestial spheres. He listened to the world as others might listen to music, not passively, but with hunger. And in the quiet of night, when others drifted into dreams, Leonardo opened his notebook. It was a simple thing, really, leather-bound, the edges worn soft from constant handling. The pages, densely filled, looked at first like chaos. Scribbles, diagrams, lists, maps, portraits. But look closely, and you'd see the order behind the storm. Spirals of thoughts unfolding toward revelation. And all of it, every word, written backwards. Mirror writing. He claimed it was to prevent smudging, but I always suspected it was more than that. Perhaps it was a habit of privacy, or maybe even a kind of humility, a way of reminding himself that understanding should come not too easily, not even to its author. I once watched him write like that for hours. He would dip the nib, tap it twice, and begin. His left hand moved swiftly, smoothly, curving across the page in a mirrored ballet. I remember how the candlelight made his eyes seem brighter, and how he whispered questions to himself under his breath. How does the tongue form a vowel? Why do birds circle before sleep? The ink dried as quickly as the questions multiplied. And if you interrupted him, if you dared speak before he paused, he would look up not with irritation, but with confusion.
As if he'd forgotten the world outside his thoughts. He was no master then, just an apprentice with too many questions and not enough time. But already he was becoming something else. Verrocchio had given him space, sometimes with admiration, sometimes with exasperation. Leonardo often left projects half-finished, chasing another idea before the first was done. But what he did finish always startled us. A study of hands so lifelike they seemed to twitch. A curl of hair that glinted like light on water. A mechanical device drawn with such clarity you wondered if it had already been built somewhere. One evening, I asked him why he spent so much time alone. He was mixing paints in silence, lost in the movement. He replied, "There's too much sound in people. I hear better in quiet places." He once brought a frog to dinner just to study its blink. Another time, he dissected a lyre to understand why certain notes made him weep. He called bees flying mathematicians and believed clouds held the secret to both chaos and order. Some thought him odd, but I think he simply saw too much. The world to Leonardo wasn't a finished painting, it was a sketch in progress, full of spaces yet to be understood. I remember vividly the night he showed me his flying machine. We were in the loft of Verrocchio's studio. It was late, and the wind tapped at the shutters like an impatient muse. He had drawn it in charcoal on the back of a wood panel. Curved wings, a spiral rotor, notes in reverse running along the side. I said, "It looks like a dream." And he answered, "Yes, but only for now." He would study birds for hours, imitating their motion with strips of parchment and twisted cords. He kept feathers in a box labeled "Truth of Flight." He said the secret was not in the wing, but in the air itself. And yet, for all his brilliance, there was loneliness in him. He did not laugh as freely as Botticelli, nor did he rage like Michelangelo. He moved through the world like a ghost looking for a form.
People admired his skill, but struggled to follow his thoughts. He once told me, "They see the face of the invention, but not the spine." He kept his notebooks close, not locked, not hidden, just always near, as if they were more part of him than his shadow. I watched him draw everything: knots, horses, hands, explosions, water eddies. He even sketched the curls of women's hair next to diagrams of pulleys and gears. Beauty and function danced on the same page. There was something sacred in his line work. Even his mistakes felt deliberate. I once found a page filled with sketches of nothing but eyes. Wide, squinting, weeping, laughing. Beneath one he had written in backward Latin, "The eye is the window of the soul, and the soul is made of questions." That phrase haunted me. I think he feared being known, not because he was ashamed, but because he was still becoming. His identity was like one of his inventions, brilliant, fragile, unfinished. To name it too soon would be to limit it. In a strange way, Leonardo's notebooks were his truest self. They held what no canvas ever could: his doubts, his distractions, his humor. One page showed a list of debts, followed by a sketch of a cat wearing a crown. Another, a recipe for varnish, next to an anatomical study of a fetus in the womb. Life was not separate for him. It was layered, tangled, luminous. He once spent 3 days drawing the muscles of the neck, not for commission, not for praise, simply to know. And the more he learned, the more he questioned. That, perhaps, was the difference between him and others. Where many sought answers, Leonardo sought deeper questions. One evening, as Florence fell into twilight and the bells tolled from Santa Croce, I found him staring out a high window. The Arno shimmered below, the city slowing into sleep. "What are you thinking?" I asked. He said nothing for a long moment.
Then, quietly, "That even time has veins, and I want to follow them all." I did not speak again. We stood there, side by side, 2 small figures in a city swollen with beauty, watching the last light sink into the river. That night he filled 27 pages. I never saw them again. But sometimes, when I watch birds wheel through the sky, or when I dip a quill into ink and pause before writing a word, I feel him beside me, still writing, still wondering, still listening. Some painters chase light, others are seduced by shadow. Sandro Botticello lived between the two, never fully in the dark, never fully in the day. His figures shimmered at the edges of myth and memory, soft and strange, as if dreamed by a soul too delicate to name. I remember the first time I entered his studio. It was late afternoon, and the light pouring through the shutters was golden, fractured, exactly the kind of light Botticello seemed to carry in his palms. The walls were lined with half-finished canvases, all tilted slightly forward, like listeners. Faces of nymphs, angels, Madonnas, all bearing that same mournful knowing in their eyes. The room smelled of crushed rose petals and vinegar. Someone had spilled a bowl of gesso. The floor was streaked with the ghost of sandalwood smoke. I stepped quietly, afraid to disturb something sacred.
He was seated before a large canvas, brush poised in mid-air, his gaze locked not on the panel, but on a single shaft of sunlight that had found its way to the corner of the room. It cast the shadow of a laurel branch across the wall, a perfect, trembling silhouette. Without turning, he said to me, "Do you see her?" I didn't know what he meant. He pointed at the shadow. "That's Daphne. She lives only for a moment. But if I catch her, she'll stay forever." And then he began to paint. That was Botticelli, always chasing something that could not last. He painted myth as if it were confession. His Venus was not just the goddess of beauty. She was the ache of desire, the yearning for purity wrapped in the illusion of flesh. His Primavera was not a celebration of spring, but a meditation on cycles of birth, temptation, remorse. He once told me that myth was truer than history. History is what men say happened. Myth is what always happens. He loved movement, not the muscular motion of Michelangelo's forms, but the drifting, the fluttering, the almost falling. Hair like waves, robes like smoke, hands forever mid-gesture. Even his stillness moved. And yet, for all his elegance, he was not a man of ease. He painted with a kind of urgency. His brush moved quickly, then stopped for long minutes, as if stunned by its own choices. He would murmur lines of Dante under his breath, or pause to watch dust swirl in the light. His apprentices feared him, but not for his temper. It was his silences that unnerved them. He could be gentle, he could be cold. He once scolded a boy not for ruining a background, but for missing the sorrow in a face. He expected not just skill, but sympathy. I saw him work on the birth of Venus over many weeks. The canvas grew slowly, as if reluctant to be born. He spent 2 days painting a single curl of hair, then finished the ocean in one afternoon. The shell, gleaming, pale, immense, was painted in silence. No music, no speech, only breath and brush. When it was done, I stood before it and felt something strange. Not admiration, but vulnerability. The goddess stood not as a symbol of perfection, but as something newly opened, like a wound or a question. I asked him, "Is she real?" He said, "No, but she is needed." That was his gift, not to show us what was, but what we longed for. He lived in a city torn between beauty and piety. Florence sang hymns by day and whispered poetry by night, and Botticelli stood at the crossroads. He painted saints with the same tenderness he gave to Venus. He gave angels human fragility. He dared to place grace beside temptation, not in opposition, but in balance. He did not fear contradiction. He welcomed it. There was a night, I remember it clearly, when Savonarola's voice rose over the rooftops like fire. The square filled with sermons, warnings, cries of repentance. Botticelli stood by his studio window, watching the crowd below. He said nothing, but the next day he painted a Madonna with tears, barely visible, almost accidental. And he never painted myth again. Some say he regretted the sensuality of his youth. Others say he burned some of his own works. I never asked him. I only know that the light in his studio changed. The colors became softer, the shadows deeper. Yet even then his figures still danced, not freely perhaps, but with restraint, like memories of joy. One day I found him drawing the same face over and over, a woman veiled, her eyes wide, uncertain. I asked who she was. He replied, "She visits me in dreams. I think she is someone I forgot to love." He kept that sketch pinned to the wall beside his desk until the day he died. There is a story, perhaps only a rumor, that he asked to be buried at the feet of Simonetta Vespucci, the muse for many of his works, and that now, in the church of Ognissanti, his bones rest beneath hers, as if the two were finally reunited. I like to believe that's true. For Botticelli, beauty was never an end. It was a mirror. It showed us not what we are, but what we ache to be. He painted shadows not to hide things, but to give light its meaning. I still see his influence in Florence, in the curve of an awning, in the sway of a dress, in the way ivy curls along the side of a chapel wall. He taught the city to sigh, not just to speak.
Tonight, as I walk the narrow streets where his feet once fell, I catch the scent of oil and lilac. A door creaks open. Light spills across the stones. And I swear, for a moment, I see a figure pass by, barefoot, robed in white, hair trailing behind her like fire caught in silk. But when I turn, she is gone. Only her shadow remains. Certainly, let's continue now with Section 8, descending into the soul of Michelangelo, his devotion, turmoil, and the solemn communion between man and stone, while preserving the gentle cadence and sensory stillness of our Renaissance night journey. Michelangelo did not sculpt statues. He exercised them. Where others saw stone, he saw resistance, not merely a block to shape, but a spirit to confront. His relationship with marble was never tender. It was devotional, yes, but fraught like a sacred duel, as if the divine had buried its truth in the earth, and only through relentless pressure could it be coaxed to rise again. The first time I saw him work, I flinched, not from fear, but from awe. He stood barefoot atop a massive slab of Carrara, a chisel gripped like a dagger, his chest bare, his hair soaked with sweat. Each strike echoed like thunder, not rhythmic, but urgent, an unpredictable storm. And yet, beneath the ferocity, there was precision. He never missed his mark, not once. His studio was less a room than a chapel of effort, sparse, dust-covered, lit by a single high window where light fell not in beams, but in sighs. The air tasted of iron and lime. His tools were lined up like monks in silence, each blade worn smooth from use. I was young when I met him, young and unready. I asked him once, timidly, what he saw when he began. He replied, "I see the soul, and the stone that suffocates it." I didn't speak again for hours. To Michelangelo, sculpture wasn't craft, it was necessity, a reckoning between mortal hands and immortal form. His figures didn't emerge, they struggled, muscles coiled in tension.
Limbs half-bound, eyes turned not upward in serenity, but inward in anguish, as if caught mid-birth, half human, half divine. He didn't merely carve bodies, he carved longing. When he worked on his Pietà, I stood near the doorway. He would not allow anyone closer. He murmured prayers, some in Latin, some improvised, some little more than breath. As the Virgin's face took shape beneath his blade, the entire room felt quieter, as if the dust itself held its breath. I remember how he paused once, resting his hand on her brow, his eyes wet. He whispered, "No mother should be younger than her son." That was his kind of poetry, simple, aching, true. He was not a gentleman. He loved without ease and spoke in fractures. He distrusted flattery and resented ease. But in the silent communion between him and his stone, there was tenderness, painful tenderness. The David, that towering colossus we now admire like a god, was to him not a symbol of power. It was fear made flesh. The boy stands with jaw clenched, fingers tense, eyes focused not on victory, but on consequence. Michelangelo didn't give us a hero triumphant. He gave us a soul deciding. He told me once, "Courage is what a man looks like before he knows he's already won." In the Medici chapel, I once watched him shape the tombs, figures of night and day, twilight and dawn. He gave them bodies that could never rest. They twist, they resist, they ache to breathe. Even in death they seem alive, or something close to it. Someone asked him why the tombs looked tormented. He answered, "Because the dead are not done." He believed time was a sculptor, that every hour pressed upon the flesh, upon the mind, shaping us without chisel or blade. He wanted his figures to bear that truth. He lived simply, a cot, a basin, a Bible. He often forgot to eat. His fingernails were always dark from dust, his clothing stiff from sweat and plaster. He did not care for appearances, only essence. And yet, he loved beauty.
Not the beauty of perfection, but of purpose. A cracked stone that held a hidden curve, a crooked nose that drew the eye to the mouth. He found divinity in flaws. He once showed me a sketch, barely more than lines and curves, the outline of a torso, unfinished. Beneath it, he'd written in small, tight script, "I cannot go further. He is already free." He believed some figures resisted him, that if the soul within did not wish to emerge, the marble would fracture, rebel. He did not blame the stone. He blamed himself. At times, he grew still for days, sitting beside a half-formed statue, eyes fixed, as if in penance. He called these pauses his prayers. But when he worked like thunder, for hours, no rest, no hesitation. His assistants struggled to keep up. Dust rose in clouds, the room shook. At the end of such days, he would fall asleep curled in the corner like a child. I once caught him talking to a statue, not with madness, but with reverence. He whispered, "I know you're tired, so am I, but I promise I will not leave you unfinished." That statue, the captive, remains half-formed, a man emerging from stone, one arm free, the other forever trapped. Some call it incomplete. I call it honest. Because Michelangelo, for all his genius, was never finished. Even in his final years, he sketched obsessively, not grand works, just hands, feet, veins, folds of skin. He told me, "To understand God, I must first understand the curve of a wrist." He did not believe in separation. Art was worship. Stone was scripture.
and the body, human, fragile, trembling, was both altar and offering. When I think of him now, I do not remember his fury or his fame. I remember the stillness after he stepped back from the block, the moment when dust settled, the candle flickered, and something new, tender, terrible, stood before us. Not man, not God, but the echo of both. As the sun lowers behind the hills of Fiesole, Florence blushes.
The air grows warmer in tone, not in temperature, and the shadows lengthen across the river Arno like fingers reaching for yesterday. This is the hour when the city stops whispering and simply glows, and there is no better place to witness it than the Ponte Vecchio. I cross the bridge slowly, the wood beneath my feet groaning gently with age. The shops that line each side lean out like old friends exchanging secrets. Their windows, cluttered with glinting jewels, reflect not just gold and silver, but the burnished sky beyond. It is a bridge of commerce, yes, but also of memory. The scent here is different than in the studios. There is less oil, less dust. Instead, I catch traces of leather, honey, and sometimes, faintly, the sharp tang of molten metal. The jewelers are finishing their day's work. Tiny hammers tap like a clock counting down toward evening. Someone closes a shutter with a metallic click. Another adjusts the placement of a necklace as though arranging a sunbeam. It was not always gold that lived here. The butchers used to run their trade on this bridge, flinging bones and offal into the river below. But the Medici grew weary of the stench and declared the space sacred to gold. And so the blood was replaced by firelight, the cleavers by engraving tools, the cries of hawkers by the hush of precision. Even now, beneath the glamour, I sometimes feel the ghost of meat and smoke lingering in the stones. Florence is layered like that, always a past beneath the present, always a shadow behind the shine. I pass a shop where a young man is setting a sapphire into a ring. His fingers move with a surgeon's focus. There's a candle beside him, though it's still light outside. The flame dances on the gem's surface, multiplying its blue. I stop for a moment to watch. He notices me, but doesn't speak. Instead, he lifts the ring slightly, letting it catch the full golden light. For a brief instant, it looks like the sky itself has curled into a circle.
He smiles and returns to his work. Further along the bridge, a woman hums softly as she sweeps her doorstep. Her broom catches the last of the day's dust. A child sits beside her, drawing circles with a stub of charcoal on the stone. Not letters, just spirals, just the need to mark presence. The Arno below flows slow, almost lazy. It holds the light like a promise, amber and rose-colored, smooth as silk. I watch my reflection shimmer, then dissolve. And for a moment I am not a man walking through Florence. I am time, flowing, witnessing itself. There is a particular irony in this bridge. It is both journey and destination. The jewelers who work here deal in permanence, gold that resists rust, gems that defy erosion. And yet their world is one of constant flux. Customers come and go, designs shift with taste. Wealth rises and vanishes like the tide. I once overheard a goldsmith say, "No piece is truly mine. I only hold it until it finds its owner." Perhaps artists are like that too. I pause near the center, where an arch opens to the river. It frames the city like a painting, the Uffizi to the left, the dome rising beyond, the hills rolling outward like ancient waves. The light here is softer, fuller, as though the sun is saying goodbye without sadness. Beside me, a small group of pilgrims speaks in hushed Latin. One holds a drawing, Botticelli's Primavera, I think, copied by hand on yellowed parchment. They are not from Florence, but they carry pieces of her in their pockets, in their voices, in their wonder. I remember being like them. I remember crossing this bridge in my youth, pockets empty, eyes wide, hands eager to hold more than they could carry. I remember thinking that gold was the highest achievement, until I stood beneath a fresco and felt my heart ache. Now I know better. Gold may endure, but it does not breathe. Art breathes. Stone sighs. Light moves. And memory, fragile as it is, sometimes outlasts them all.
As I stand watching the sunset gild the rooftops, I hear a lute begin to play. Somewhere on the other side of the bridge, a musician sings of lost love. The tune is familiar, an old folk melody layered with longing. His voice is rough but tender, like worn velvet. A shopkeeper leans on his doorway, listening. A cat curls beneath a bench, tail twitching. A couple pauses to embrace, framed perfectly in the archway. And still the gold gleams. It gleams not because of wealth, but because it catches what matters, light and time, and the eyes of those who dare to stop and see. There is something sacred in that. I move on. At the far end of the bridge, the traffic of life resumes. Carts rattle by. A merchant calls out the price of pears. A painter sells sketches of the Duomo on parchment curled with sun. But I carry with me the hush of the Ponte Vecchio, its golden hush, as if some part of me has turned to reflection. Florence has many marvels, domes and chapels, masters and masterpieces. But for me, it is in these quiet crossings where the city becomes most itself, where the sacred and the simple blend, where commerce becomes communion, and where, in the dying light of day, even gold seems humbled. I walk now in rooms that no longer echo. The great palaces of Florence once rang with voices, debates over sculpture and scripture, whispered schemes over parchment maps, poetry recited beside flickering firelight. Now they hum with a slower music, one woven from silence, velvet, and dust. This is the hour when even the wealthiest shadows grow still. I stand in the grand hall of a Medici residence. The air is perfumed with cedar and aging books. The windows are open, but the breeze has grown shy, moving the curtains only enough to remind us that night is coming. Tapestries line the walls, mythic hunts, celestial patterns, coats of arms now more remembered than relevant. They move slightly, almost imperceptibly, as if sighing. The room smells of beeswax and old paper. A candle has just been lit, and its small flame trembles near the corner, caught in the brass reflection of an unplayed lute. Here the great patrons of Florence once held court, not kings, but tastemakers, bankers and thinkers, collectors of genius. Cosimo, who placed his trust in thinkers and saw no contradiction between coin and cathedral.
Lorenzo, whose nickname the Magnificent was not so much praise as it was inevitability. He believed in beauty, in books, in the strength of a subtle smile. It was in rooms like this that he would meet with Botticelli, with Michelangelo, with Ficino and Poliziano, and the others who floated between art and philosophy like fish in the same shimmering stream. The table before me still bears the marks of use, ink stains, a wine ring, a scratch from a dagger accidentally unsheathed in too much excitement. It is not just a surface, it is a witness. I brush my fingers across it and imagine the voices that once danced above this wood. Not loud, but layered. Discussions of canvas prices, debates over mythological accuracy, musings about Greek verses no longer fully understood. I do not hear what they said, but I feel what they meant. One evening, I remember Michelangelo arriving late, hair wild, breath short. He held a small sketch between his fingers, a design for a tomb, no bigger than a letter. Lorenzo took it, studied it for a long time, then said softly, "Even death will want to rest here." No applause, no flattery, just the quiet recognition of something eternal. That was the Florence they built, not with armies, but with attention. They listened to beauty, they funded doubt, they gave curiosity a home. A servant passes quietly behind me, placing a small dish of figs on a side table. His footsteps are barely audible. He glances toward me just once and nods, as if we both understand that this space belongs to many, not just the living. Above us hangs a portrait.
A woman in profile, draped in coral fabric, her brow high, her expression unreadable. Her face is idealized, yes, but not emptied. You sense she had thoughts she did not speak, secrets even the painter did not hear. I once asked a Medici archivist why so many of their portraits looked away. He replied, because in Florence the face was never the whole story. I move toward the far end of the hall, where light fades more quickly. A globe sits beneath a small archway, its countries misshapen by ancient guesses. Someone has marked it in ink, a route across a sea that had not yet been named. The ink is faded, but the longing is not. That is the strange gift of these rooms. They do not end in the past. They stretch forward like maps unrolling toward tomorrow. There is music here, though none plays. It's in the weave of the rug, the grain of the chair, the candlelight that kisses a fresco just high enough to blur the edge of an angel's wing. I sit. The chair creaks, but not in protest, in memory. From this view, I can see the curve of the painted ceiling, gold leaf embedded in a sunburst pattern, stars, constellations, and beneath them a Latin inscription I've forgotten how to read. No matter. I know what it says without the words. You are a brief light in a long night. Shine accordingly. Outside, a bell rings. Not urgent, not mournful, just present. A sound with no demand, only rhythm. I think of how many artists passed through halls like these, not for praise, but for permission, to work, to imagine, to fail without exile. Lorenzo once said, "If we fund only what we understand, we become no wiser." So he gave money to men who drew flying machines, who painted gods with human limbs, who dared to say that Venus and the Virgin were sisters in grace. That generosity became the soil from which Florence bloomed.
The window beside me darkens. A moth brushes against the glass, briefly illuminated by the candle's flame before drifting away.
Insects hum in the garden below. The city has not gone quiet, it has merely softened. Somewhere in the palace I hear a page turn, or perhaps it is only in memory. These halls no longer host grand banquets. They host something quieter, the aftertaste of vision, the weightless hum of what was once risk and what is now heritage. I close my eyes and hear footsteps, leather on stone, fading down a corridor I never explored. Laughter, faint and private. The clink of a spoon against porcelain. A sigh before a sentence not spoken. The tapestries sway again, not with wind, but with breath. Someone once said that Florence's palaces were too extravagant, but they are not monuments, they are vessels. And in this twilight hour, they remind us not of the names who built them, but of the souls who passed through them with questions, sketches, whispers, and hopes stitched into their coats. The sky outside has turned indigo, and within this room, gold gives way to gray. But the light has not left, it has only knelt, resting its head on the shoulder of night. Florence does not speak loudly at night. It exhales. In these hours, when the streets are nearly empty and the river has turned to ink, the city becomes something softer, less a place, more a presence. The walls still stand, yes, the arches and towers, the courtyards and domes, but they no longer announce themselves. They listen. And if you walk slowly enough, with your breath low and your eyes unfocused, you may begin to hear the names. Not spoken, not carved, but echoed. Leonardo, Sandro, Michelangelo, Filippo, Domenico, Andrea, even those whose names the stones have swallowed. Assistants, apprentices, scribes, lovers, dreamers, doubters. They are still here, not in the art, but in the spaces between. I take the back streets now, cobbled veins winding toward nothing in particular. The windows are mostly dark, but here and there a sliver of lamplight slices through the shutters, pooling like memory on the stone. My footsteps are unhurried. Each tap against the ground joins 1,000 others beneath it. Footsteps that once carried paintings, marble, letters, secrets, regrets. Florence was built as much by walking as by planning. So much was decided on foot. I pass a doorway marked with soot. The wood is old, the handle worn smooth. I once knew the boy who lived here. He made ink from burnt walnuts and sold it in tiny glass vials. He wanted to be a poet. I never read his verses, but I remember his laugh, thin, melodic, a little too quick. He died in winter, long ago. His name was Silvestro. I say it now, quietly, and the silence accepts it. Not all names survive in marble. Some survive in moments. Near the market square, I sit on a bench worn concave by years of elbows, baskets, and unspoken worries. Above me, a faded fresco peeks out from a crumbling wall. Just the curve of a robe, the hint of a halo. Rain has smudged most of it away, but somehow that makes it more intimate, as if the city only wants to remember part of it, as if forgetting the rest is a kindness. Florence has no need to remember everything. It remembers what matters. I close my eyes and feel the texture of the air change. It cools, not with weather, but with history. The kind that folds around you like a blanket sewn from pages, brushstrokes, and quiet grief. The kind that tells you,
You are not the first to wonder if you matter. You are not the first to walk these streets with more questions than answers. Not the first to feel the weight of genius pressing down from above, from domes and statues and ceilings painted with truths too vast to hold. And you will not be the last. Sometimes I imagine the city as a great cathedral with no roof. Its chapels are streets, its saints are artists, and its altar is silence. At night, its choir is the wind through the alleys. Its incense is the scent of warm stone and lavender rising from the gardens.
Tonight, as I walk the narrow streets where his feet once fell, I catch the scent of oil and lilac. A door creaks open, light spills across the stones, and I swear, for a moment, I see a figure pass by, barefoot, robed in white, hair trailing behind her like fire caught in silk. But when I turn, she is gone. Only her shadow remains. Michelangelo did not sculpt statues. He exorcised them. Where others saw stone, he saw resistance. Not merely a block to shape, but a spirit to confront. His relationship with marble was never tender. It was devotional, yes, but fraught, like a sacred duel, as if the divine had buried its truth in the earth, and only through relentless pressure could it be coaxed to rise again. The first time I saw him work, I flinched, not from fear, but from awe. He stood barefoot atop a massive slab of Carrara, a chisel gripped like a dagger, his chest bare, his hair soaked with sweat. Each strike echoed like thunder, not rhythmic, but urgent, an unpredictable storm. And yet, beneath the ferocity, there was precision. He never missed his mark, not once. His studio was less a room than a chapel of effort, sparse, dust-covered, lit by a single high window, where light fell not in beams, but in sighs. The air tasted of iron and lime. His tools were lined up like monks in silence, each blade worn smooth from use. I was young when I met him, young and unready. I asked him once, timidly, what he saw when he began. He replied, "I see the soul, and the stone that suffocates it." I didn't speak again for hours. To Michelangelo, sculpture wasn't craft, it was necessity, a reckoning between mortal hands and immortal form. His figures didn't emerge, they struggled, muscles coiled in tension. And I release it, gently, into the silence. Tonight, Florence is not a city. It is a memory. Not mine alone, nor yours, something shared, half remembered, half invented. A dream passed between centuries, like a folded note, still warm from the hand that wrote it. I walk with no direction now. The streets curve gently, no longer leading, only unfolding. Buildings lean inward like old friends, their shutters half closed, as if listening in sleep. The moon, high above, drapes the rooftops in silver gauze. I step into a narrow alley where the stones are uneven and the shadows have edges. A lantern flickers once, then dies. But I do not need light. The city glows from within. Here, a fountain whispers beside a wall covered in ivy. Its trickle is not water, but time, drops that echo long after they fall. Beneath the arch nearby, I see a painted face, faded,
saintly, watching me with a gaze so gentle, I forget to look away. In the distance, a cat crosses the street, pauses, then disappears into the stillness. A bell tolls far off, not to mark the hour, but to remind me that time is still breathing. Everything is soft now. The chisel becomes whisper, the brush becomes breath. The dome becomes a dream of a sky we once reached for and almost touched. A breeze moves through the courtyard of an unnamed chapel. I follow it, barefoot now. I do not remember when I removed my shoes. The ground is cool and smooth. I feel the indentations where countless others walked before me. Pilgrims, painters, patrons, lovers. Dust clings to my skin, but it is not dirt. It is memory, fine and familiar. The same dust that once floated above unfinished canvases, above the bowed heads of apprentices, carving angels from broken stone. I pass a fountain where someone has left a sprig of rosemary. It rests on the edge like an offering, quiet, fragrant, unnoticed by all but me. I do not take it. I only breathe. I step inside a chapel whose door is never locked. Inside, there is no sound.
Frescoes line the walls, softened by time, blurred at the edges. Faces gaze downward, robes flow in unnatural wind. A figure raises one hand in blessing, or maybe in farewell. I stand before her for a long time. There is no plaque, no artist's name, only the hush of pigment becoming silence. I sit on a bench and close my eyes, and in that darkness I see Florence not as it was, but as it always is. A ripple of silk on a merchant's table, the gleam of oil on a freshly stretched canvas, the spark from a chisel as it strikes the hidden curve of a cheekbone, a half-finished sonnet smudged by candle wax, a hand touching another's sleeve before parting without a word. I see a hallway lit by fireflies, a staircase curving into cloud, a statue stepping forward not to speak but to remember. And behind it all, beneath it all, someone breathing, slowly, deeply. Maybe it is you, maybe it is me. I do not walk now, I drift. The city carries me gently, like a page turning itself, like pigment dissolving in water, like a sigh released at last. I no longer see buildings, only shapes, only color, only the echo of stone becoming voice. There is no need to return. Florence is not a place we leave. It is the dream we enter night after night. And now the dream begins. Tonight, Florence is not a city. It is a memory. Not mine alone, nor yours. Something shared, half remembered, half invented. A dream passed between centuries like a folded note, still warm from the hand that wrote it. I walk with no direction now. The streets curve gently, no longer leading, only unfolding. Buildings lean inward like old friends, their shutters half closed, as if listening in sleep. The moon high above drapes the rooftops in silver gauze. I step into a narrow alley where the stones are uneven and the shadows have edges. A lantern flickers once, then dies. But I do not need light. The city glows from within. Here a fountain whispers beside a wall covered in ivy. Its trickle is not water, but time. Drops that echo long after they fall. Beneath the arch nearby, I see a painted face, faded, saintly, watching me with a gaze so gentle I forget to look away. In the distance, a cat crosses the street, pauses, then disappears into the stillness. A bell tolls far off, not to mark the hour, but to remind me that time is still breathing. Everything is soft now. The chisel becomes whisper, the brush becomes breath, the dome becomes a dream of a sky we once reached for and almost touched. A breeze moves through the courtyard of an unnamed chapel. I follow it, barefoot now. I do not remember when I removed my shoes. The ground is cool and smooth. I feel the indentations where countless others walked before me. Pilgrims, painters, patrons, lovers. Dust clings to my skin, but it is not dirt. It is memory, fine and familiar. The same dust that once floated above unfinished canvases, above the bowed heads of apprentices carving angels from broken stone. I pass a fountain where someone has left a sprig of rosemary. It rests on the edge like an offering, quiet, fragrant, unnoticed by all but me. I do not take it. I only breathe. I step inside a chapel whose door is never locked. Inside, there is no sound. Frescoes line the walls, softened by time, blurred at the edges. Faces gaze downward, robes flow in unnatural wind. A figure raises one hand, in blessing or maybe in farewell. I stand before her for a long time. There is no plaque, no artist's name, only the hush of pigment becoming silence. I sit on a bench and close my eyes. And in that darkness, I see Florence not as it was, but as it always is. A ripple of silk on a merchant's table, the gleam of oil on a freshly stretched canvas, the spark from a chisel as it strikes the hidden curve of a cheekbone, a half-finished sonnet smudged by candle wax, a hand touching another's sleeve before parting without a word. I see a hallway lit by fireflies, a staircase curving into cloud,
A statue stepping forward, not to speak, but to remember. And behind it all, beneath it all, someone breathing, slowly, deeply. Maybe it is you, maybe it is me. I do not walk now, I drift. The city carries me gently, like a page turning itself, like pigment dissolving in water, like a sigh released at last. I no longer see buildings, only shapes, only color, only the echo of stone becoming voice. There is no need to return. Florence is not a place we leave. It is the dream we enter, night after night. And now the dream begins.